Hey everybody.
Tonight we're going to have Brett McCracken on.
Today we're having Brett McCracken on.
He's got red hair and he's very smart.
He got red hair and he's very smart.
We're going to talk about movies and TV shows.
We're going to talk about movies and TV shows.
But I also wanted to remind you.
On September 27th.
On September 27th. We're going to have Matthew Paul Turner. On the podcast. So go ahead. And subscribe on iTunes. And the Stitcher app. To the Theologues podcast. Say, enjoy the show. Hello, you're listening to the Theologues Roundtable Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Perkins, writer, editor, and co-founder of Theologues.com, which is an online forum of individuals bringing to you articles and in-depth conversations on theology and tradition. In this show, we are all about Christ, his church, and strong whiskey, or at least in Brandon's case, cheap whiskey. Let me start by introducing our panelists and guests. Actually, I'm going to hand that off to Brandon. Brandon, my comrade at arms, is going to actually be running the conversation tonight, and I'll let him introduce the rest of our panelists and our special guests for tonight.
Well, I would like to say good evening, and good evening to everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. This is a podcast that I'm very excited about. I know that I say that every time that I do this podcast, and I know that I say that I enjoy every podcast every time that I do the podcast. But if you're listening on live stream, I would like to let you know that you can feel free to save your comments. Don't save your comments, as a matter of fact. Leave your comments. My goodness, we want to get to every single comment that we can. So if you have questions for Brett or any of the rest of us on the chat, we will get to them if and as we are able. But I'm going to take a little bit of time and just introduce the people that are on with us this evening. So first, I would like to introduce my twin brother, partner in crime, and foul-mouthed, the inimitable Brian Peach. And Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and I will try to rein in my foul mouth.
That would be greatly appreciated. We also have tonight with us Stan. Some call him Saran Stan. He is a new father. I think my brother just fell out of his chair there. But Stan Patton is joining us, and his daughter Jillian is now how old?
Now something like 7, 8, 9 days. 9 days old, I think.
Okay, and how are you, Stan?
Doing pretty good, surviving on little sleep and extremely inarticulate and prone to embarrassment. But yes, I'm Stan Patton, and I'm an armchair theologian. I like to argue on the internet, and I design video games for a living.
Thank you for joining us, Stan. It's so great to have you this evening, and I can sympathize with you a great deal. We have a 3-month-old, and he has been a nightmare today due to the fact that he is teething, and he's also just a bit of a grump. So he takes after not his biological father, but his adoptive father. And now for the guest that we have on tonight is someone who, if you follow me on social media, or if you know me personally, you'll know that Brett McCracken is someone I'm a huge fan of. I've admired his work for several years. His reviews of media, and particularly film, have appeared on Christianity Today. He's written for Relevant Magazine. He is just an amazing guy. And Brett, I have to tell you, I'm a huge fanboy. So anyone listening to our podcast is going to be aware of that, simply because of the questions that I've asked. But Brett is a Los Angeles-based writer. a journalist. He's the author of Hipster Christianity, When Church and Cool Collide, which was published in 2010. And he also published more recently Gray Matters, Navigating the Space Between Legalism and Liberty. He's written, in addition to the publications that I've discussed, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Huffington Post, CNN.com, the Princeton Theological Review, Books and Culture, etc., etc., etc. He speaks frequently at lectures. He does university talks. He talks at churches and conferences. Brett is a graduate of Wheaton College and UCLA, where he has his master's in cinema and media studies, but he currently works as the managing editor for Biola University's Biola magazine, and he is pursuing a master's in theology at Talbot School of Theology. Is there anything, Brett, that I missed that would be an additional feather in your cap?
I think you more than covered it, and I'm a little embarrassed with how extensive that was. But thank you so much, Brandon, for having me, and all of you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we're so happy to have you here. And what we want to talk about tonight is something that's very interesting to me and something that Brett has written extensively about. And that question is the arts and culture of Christianity today, and how they perhaps differ from the arts and culture of Christianity in the past. So to give our listeners a little bit of background, the faith has been historically a leader in arts and culture, from everyone like Bach and his music, writing a song for the Lord day after day, to people like Michelangelo, whose incredible works have inspired people to look at the faith in the past, look back at the Bible, and all the way up to fairly recent authors like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who sort of took up the mantle of the Dantes of the past and said there is something to be said, something to be written, something to be created that relates to Christianity, and they did that in a way that still influences our pop culture today. However,
and let's not forget about Bono.
And right. There's also Bono of U2. Brian, can you go back to where your mic was? Can you go back to where your mic was silent there? So the question that we're asking tonight is really a question of what Christianity is doing in today's culture in terms of art. Why does it look different than the art that was produced by Christianity in the past? And what is there to be done about it, if anything? So I'm going to throw this first question to Brett, who's an expert, if I can call him that. Brett, what do you think is the difference between, in American culture today, the type of Christian art that is being produced and the type of Christian art that has been produced in the past?
Yeah, wow. I mean, there's a million differences I could point out. I think one obvious one that we would all kind of recognize is just beauty. If you look at the art, the Christian art of old, I was just in Italy this last year and saw the Sistine Chapel and saw some of Michelangelo's sacred works. And I mean, it was just beautiful. It's lasted centuries and is still regarded as just jaw-droppingly beautiful. And I think there's very little Christian, quote-unquote Christian art, whether we're talking about movies or painting or whatever, that would kind of be universally agreed as something that's beautiful and that will last as long as those things of old have lasted. So I think that's one big difference. Another one that I've been thinking a lot about recently is I think a lot of the attempts at Christian art these days tend to be very message-centric and very very concerned with the transmission of a message, the art form, whatever it is, whether it's music or a film. It's only really there insofar as it can communicate the Christian message in an efficient way, and the form itself is not really all that emphasized as much as its utilitarian kind of practical transmission aspect. And I think that's very different from some of the Christian art previous centuries, where kind of the beautiful forms themselves and the artistry itself was kind of the end goal, and that there was sacred, content, I guess, but the forms are what made it significant, and what makes it something that we still talk about in art history classes, and and on our tours of Europe's great art museums. So those are just a few. I could go on, but
you could. I mean, we could talk for hours about that. But I mean, if you look at some of the things that are being produced as Christian art today, for instance, the paintings of Thomas Kincaid, the movies that we see, the Facing the Giants or Fireproof or God's Not Dead, things like that, or even the Christian literature that we see. It's a huge thing in our area. I don't know if this is global or if it's national or something like that, but we see a lot of in central Pennsylvania Amish love stories that a lot of Christians are really buying into. This sort of romanticized Amish literature that on its face and by its nature is very similar to a Twilight type story without the vampires and the sex and whatnot. And so why do you feel that our art has taken that type of turn, whereas now it's utilitarian, where once it was to create and to reveal beauty? I mean, and in almost an imitation of our creator, the ultimate creator. So when we create, the idea used to be we're creating something beautiful that's not message driven. It's driven by the truth and the honesty in the beauty and the creation in and of itself. Almost like the poet John Keats said, truth is beauty, beauty's truth. So how have we strayed from that? Why have we gotten away from that?
Yeah, wow.
You can say I don't know also.
I definitely don't have the, smoking gun answer to that, but I have some thoughts. I mean, the Amish Christian romance novel thing is funny to me. A couple of my buddies and I used to do caption contests where one of us would find a really funny Amish Christian romance novel cover and send the photo around, and we just make fake captions to it, because it's it's such a knockoff of the romance novel generally. It's just kind of the Christian version of it. It's like a sanitized, safe version, and I think that's what you see in genre after genre, whether we're talking about music or film or novels or whatever the case may be. In the last 50 years especially, you've seen kind of these Christian subversions created where it's like the secular culture is doing this and it seems to be popular, so let's do a Christian version of it that all of our Christians can consume and not be tainted and not be negatively impacted. So
can I speak to that for a second?
You can in just a moment, Brian, and I thank you for popping in just then. But we will get to Brett's book, Gray Matters, which deals with some of these issues with Christian liberty and some of the things that we're allowed to consume. Obviously, there's no limit to what we're allowed to consume under the new covenant. However, what's beneficial for us to consume. So I think that what you spoke to, this sort of sanitized version of the romance novel, is kind of the opposite of Christian liberty. It's taking that Christian liberty and approaching it from a very legalistic, but no less sort of affected perspective. So, Brian, your thoughts on this?
One of my favorite, probably my favorite ever movie review that I've ever read was
Tree of Life.
No. A movie
Brett's review of Tree of Life was almost as moving as the film itself. That's all.
It was fantastic, and that's not what I want to get to. On December 18th of last year, Brett reviewed Her, which has been a very, very important movie in my life. And what struck me about the movie wasn't initially the way that I tend to watch movies is, I look at the Rotten Tomato sort of percentage, and then I go and see the movie, and then I'll read the reviews subsequently. And after seeing the movie, which was very moving and affecting, especially because I was going through the end of my marriage at the time, you had a very unique perspective on that movie. A movie that maybe most Christians wouldn't touch with a 3-foot stick. Right?
Yeah.
You examined the relationship between a human male and his digital counterpart. And you talked a lot. You wrote your review about a week before Christmas. And you talked a lot about the incarnation. You may not remember it. It was a long time ago. But it was a review that really affected me. So there are two questions that I have here, and one, the easy question is, like, how did you draw your conclusion? How did you watch this movie and sort of sense the power and the importance of the incarnation of God himself? And secondly, when you're watching a movie, how do you know what to say about the movie in Christian terms? I mean, are you looking to watch a movie and say, well, I'm going to try to interpret this through Christianity, or are you watching a movie on its own terms, or even experiencing art on its own terms and saying, I can see Christ through this? Two very different things.
Yeah, no, good questions. And I'll take the second one first. When I review a film, or when I'm asked to review a film for Christianity Today, I definitely have that audience and that idea of integrating my faith, into my reading of the film in the back of my mind. But I wouldn't say that as I'm watching the film, I'm like looking for Christ figures or anything like that. I like to experience films on their own terms, just experiencing them in this kind of like impactful way as the filmmakers, intended them to be experienced. And so I don't like coming to any film with an agenda. I don't even like to take notes in the theater. A lot of critics do that.
Sure.
So I just like to experience it, take its full impact upon myself, and then later mull it over and think about it, through the lens of my faith. And I can't help but look at it through that lens. It's not like it's a weird kind of artificial thing that I impose on it. I am a Christian. It's a huge part of my identity. So I've just that's the way I look at everything. And the way I look at a film, the way I look at food, the way I look at anything is through that lens. So to me, it's never feels like an add-on, where I write a review. I don't write a review and then I'm like, oh no, I need to add a paragraph of Christian stuff so it'll be published in Christianity Today. And the fact is, some films don't lend themselves that well to kind of that Christian perspective. And certainly there's some films that I write a review for Christianity Today, and it very well could, read like a review in the LA Times or any other publication. But whenever there is something that immediately strikes me as, that corresponds to this aspect of Christianity or my faith, I definitely, I love writing about that. And so with the case of Her, definitely, watching that movie at the beginning of Advent and being in that state of mind where, I don't know about you guys, but I'm very liturgical. I really get into the church calendar, and so I take Advent very seriously.
We are all very liturgical.
We're there. We're right there with you.
Good. It's a great thing. It's a beautiful thing. So I had just, been meditating and contemplating Advent and thinking really deeply about the incarnation and just what a crazy, mind-blowing thing it is. And so when I watched this movie, this very powerful movie, in which one of the most moving dynamics, I think, is the point in the film where Joaquin Phoenix's character really starts to understand that this entity that he's fallen in love with, Samantha, I think was the name, Scarlett Johansson's character, he starts to realize that her intelligence and her just power and her being is just far beyond who he is, and he can't relate to that, and she's just this cosmic mystery that has taken kind of this digital form that he can relate to, but at the end of the day, she's almost godlike, and so I really did feel like Scarlett Johansson's character in the film was this godlike entity from the cosmos who took up residence in the form of this little phone, and it immediately struck me like, there's a corollary there between the mystery of the incarnation, the God of the universe who took up this tiny form, so that we could relate, so that we as humans, as middling, limited humans, could understand and relate to God. And at the same time, we can relate to Jesus, God incarnate, but there's also this distance and this kind of unfathomable aspect. And I really resonated with Joaquin Phoenix and feeling kind of the pain of that a little bit. So, yeah, that was kind of my mindset when I wrote that review. And I don't know what that review would have looked like if it came out in July or if it wasn't during the Christmas season, it'd probably be a much different review. But yeah, I love the film, and it's cool that you liked the review.
Well, and I think that this speaks to something even deeper, Brett, is that you are viewing art for so during the and during and after the French Revolution, there was this the phrase "l'art pour l'art," or the art for the sake of art, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you approach a review, you approach it not primarily as someone looking to get a Christian message from it, but as a holistic human being, as a person who approaches and believes in the importance and beauty of art, and naturally your relationship with Christ and your faith corresponds with everything, like you said you do, whether it's food or whether it's art. But naturally, art is something that's deeply moving. It's impactful. It's something that's meant to move us. So I just want to take what Brian asked you and the kind of almost intense theology that you put into that film review without even trying to do it, without even thinking, all right, I've got to add Jesus stuff in here. And I want to ask the rest of our panelists, how is it that we're viewing art and in Christianity in our modern era, in this zeitgeist, how is it that we're viewing art incorrectly? And I want to toss that question first to back to Stan.
Yeah, so I spent several years as a product manager doing a lot of data analysis, and that the effect of it is kind of made me excited about the boring. It's made me look for kind of the easy answer that kind of explains a pattern that could have an exciting answer, but probably doesn't. Because there's like this heuristic where it's like the more boring an answer is, the more likely it is to be true. And when I think about the lack of you look back and there's all this great Christian art coming into all these places, and so some of the stuff is timeless and it just blows everyone away, and everyone universally recognizes it as amazing pieces. And then you come to today where you have a bunch of stuff that's pretty much garbage. I think it's mostly explainable in terms of just kind of a supply and demand issue, where there's just not a lot of demand for extremely high quality and kind of avant-garde or really boundary pushing art. Like no one is kind of funding that. Whereas there is a lot of funding for just kind of product art.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of also segues into the other explanation for it, which is there's a big selection bias at play where we are all talking about what Christian art we have all been exposed to. And so what we are talking about are things like Thomas Kincaid and God's Not Dead and all these garbage films. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about things that have extremely high surfacing. And the only way they got to that point is because they were commercial endeavors that were funded into being surfaced.
Right.
And that like things that people are doing on their own and in their free time and independently. They're making some beautiful music. They're making some beautiful art, but that's not going to be necessarily surface to us. And so I think selection bias goes a long way to explain why, we all recognize Michelangelo, but we don't recognize, Mike Angelo living in Michigan and making beautiful Christian art that we don't see.
Mike
Brett,
Angelo is one
that?
of my favorite artists.
Yes,
Michelangelo.
he is universally recognized as one of the best and most underpaid artists in the West Coast at this time. But but Brett, your thoughts on what Stan said?
Yeah, I think Stan's right on just about the market aspect. I think there are a lot of the reason why these low quality films and low quality Christian art keep being made is because that's what the Christian market seems to respond to, and there doesn't seem to be a big demand for, highly artistic, highly nuanced, complex Christian art that isn't clear in its message. And I think that just Protestants in general, going back to the Reformation, where so much of the Protestant Reformation was about kind of the message being transmitted to the masses via the written form and the printing press, and so Christianity took on a very message transmission aspect as opposed to kind of a more incarnational aesthetic, perhaps, tone in previous eras of Christianity. So we're living in kind of we're the heirs to that tradition. So we're still very much. We respond to the clarity of the message is the ultimate goal as Christians. So I think a lot of evangelicals, a lot of Protestant Christians today just don't understand, like, why would you make a piece of art that's quote unquote Christian, but it's unclear what you're trying to say? Like, what's the point of that? How is that saving souls? How is that making any impact in the world? So you're right. There are people out there. I know lots of people of faith, very committed Christians who are making amazing art, but they're not being recognized because it's difficult art. It's not readily discernible what the point is or what the kind of takeaway 3-point sermon takeaway is. So yeah, it's unfortunate, and part of what my kind of mission as a journalist and as an author of books is, I would say, is to kind of, I don't know, just retrain other Christians to appreciate art in a different way, and to kind of become more to see the value in art for its own sake, and beauty and complexity, and just the reality that the faith that we hold dear. I mean, there's a lot of complexity even within it. It's not like it's just this clear thing that we've discovered the final answer to everything.
Absolutely. Even though we treat it that way.
Yeah, we treat it that way, but that just reduces it and minimizes it in such a terrible way. And so when I see a Christian artist who, like Sufjan Stevens, for example, like, he wrestles with faith in a very profound way, because he questions it, and he asks, he wrestles with the theodicy and difficult questions like that, and that's just territory that the mainstream, evangelical masses don't seem to have a hunger for, sadly.
And so we are, in a sense, heirs to one of the. It's difficult to call it a fault of the Protestant Reformation, given what they were dealing with at the time. but we are dealing with, in a very real sense, the end result of that in American evangelicalism, where what we have as Christian art is, in a sense, it's pandering. It's entirely message driven, and sometimes the message itself is dubious, and sometimes the art, most of the times the art itself is lost to the message. And so I want to bring in Zach, who feels strongly about this. Zach, what do you think about the Protestant Reformation and how that sort of affected our American evangelical approach to art?
Well, Brandon, it screwed us. No, I'm just kidding. So I've been thinking about this because I think one of the big things that we often don't think about when we think about the iconoclastic way that art is that we approach the gospel between Protestants and Catholics. Iconoclasm is at the center a lot of how art develops, I think, and how we think of art today. Because let's just take, for example, how like Brandon was saying earlier, evangelicals become more concerned about Brett, you were saying this, they become more concerned about the message and getting the message out there, and the obliqueness of the message just doesn't do it. If it's not going to be doable if it's oblique and mysterious. And I think that comes down to about, even how you see salvation between the two. One is it's an ontological change. I think the Catholic and Orthodox would both say that this is an ontological change, and it's something that's ongoing. It's a process that continues to go in you, and it's something that happens over and over and over again inside of you. And in a way, it is mysterious and oblique because it is what God's doing. But for the evangelical, the mystery just isn't there. It's more about this happened. You know the exact day and time that it happened. You had that experience, and from then on, it's just you are now living it out. You are now inside of it, and so what happens is, that kind of translates in how you create and how you live your life. You see through that lens of. It's not a process. I'm still, in some one sense you see it as a process, but it's more aesthetically, it's a process. It's not an actual, I am transforming to me and changing. It's more like I'm kind of developing into that thing that God wants me to be and already sees me as. And so when you look at art, I think, in terms of the differences between the two, you're seeing that it's for the evangelical, it becomes about, hey, we want you to see this message clearly because the aesthetics are important. And the meaning, and we want you to make sure that you get that message soundly and clearly because we want you to make that decision and make sure that you get that because that's what matters. But for when you're making art, take for example one of my favorite authors, Flannery O'Connor, a Catholic author. She was able to take stories about people and spirituality and make them in a realistic sense. She was able to place them in a situation that is natural to our world, and start to develop real characteristics in her characters. She worked on these challenges. But when you're making, for example, a Christian story or a Christian film or narrative in the evangelical world, the narrative becomes about, there was a challenge and then you overcame it and the end. It's not that there's going to be ongoing challenges or that there will be more to that story. It's more like there's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right. Self-contained.
Right.
Let's let Brett talk about that, and then we're going to and talk about the idea that you brought up about the iconoclast and then we're going to involve Brian, who is raring to speak here. But Brett, your impression of what Zach just put forth, I imagine that just in your work and in your writing, you've probably found very similar things and probably drawn similar conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, that was very well put. And there were two things that it reminded me of that just made me think about. And one, just as to what you were just talking about in terms of like this very like self-contained narrative where the problem is solved and it's just nice and tidy. Two recent films, we have already mentioned God's Not Dead, Heaven is for Real. Just the titles alone kind of indicate like the type of story this is. Like the title alone
absolutely
is a proposition. It's God is not dead. So right there, you know where the film is going to land. There's not going to be any questions. Like it's clear before you even start watching the film. This is a film that is arguing that God is not dead there. So there's no other mystery in the world. God's not dead. And then Heaven is for Real is the same thing. Another Christian story that indicates where it's kind of arguing in the title itself. So you can just see right there where Christian films a lot of times are coming from. They're just not really interested in these open-ended kind of glimpses into existence as much as nice, tidy, moral stories that either argue a clear point or portray a nice message. And then the other thing that I just thought of was just the way we read Scripture as Protestants. And I don't know about you guys, but I grew up in a very like kind of Awana-centric like Bible memory Sunday school.
Yeah,
and it was it was all about.
I think most of us agree.
Yeah, so that approach is all about memorizing just isolated passages plucked from one passage from Romans and one passage from John and a couple Psalms. And growing up, I had a lot of individual scriptures memorized, but I had no concept of kind of the narrative of Scripture and how the whole arc of it worked. And so that is also, I think, shows you a way that we've lost our way kind of in terms of we've become so just concept driven and less narrative driven. It's more about just the points of our doctrine that we need to get right and less about the incarnational big picture just experience of the faith and what God is doing in the world. So yeah, I was just thinking about this with Romans because I went to Rome with my wife last year, and it was just so cool to actually see the physical spaces where Paul was and where part of the New Testament happened in this spot. And I was just thinking back to my childhood and having memorized the Romans Road, which is like, you guys know what that is. It's like a series of 5.
Oh yes.
It's like the roadmap to how to be saved, right? And so I knew that like the back of my hand, but I had no concept that Rome, was an actual place that narrative happened and the unfolding of the early history of the church happened there. It was all about the concepts. It was all about understanding kind of the theological concepts as it applied to me as an individual and what I needed to do to be saved. And so actually being in Rome this year and seeing all that just reminded me like, wow, there's so much more power when you kind of encounter that incarnational story narrative of the Bible rather than just plucking out the important messages that you need to know in order to be saved.
See, now you're challenging my faith because that's the only reason that I'm a Christian is the road to salvation.
Yeah,
so.
I don't want to
totally
throw anyone's
Just kidding.
Yeah.
We do want to this idea of an incarnational view of Christianity and seeing that through art, and the idea of being an iconoclast, like Zach brought up. These are very, very important and really untapped kind of concepts in evangelical Christianity as we know it in America. However, I don't think that they're too heady or too weighty for us to be able to really reach evangelical culture and explain and express why art is important. The idea of the iconoclast goes back for centuries and centuries. It's a term that I think was first used in French. It was originally used by the Eastern Church to describe people, followers of the Eastern Church, who were destroying religious images that they thought were idols. But nowadays, in the Protestant Reformation, which we talked about as sort of the entry point to the way our cultural milieu views art, the Protestant Reformation did a great deal of damage to the faith by vandalizing former Catholic churches and saying they're being idols. Their faith is not our faith. So they were attacking Orthodox institutions. They were attacking the apostolic institutions and saying this art, even though it's art, if you want to call it capital A art, is not good enough for us because it's not message driven.
Well, no, they were doing that because they did not want. They were taking the Bible so seriously on idolatry that they decided to break anything that resembles idolatry within the church. That's what iconoclasm really started to be about. But the underlying problem with that is then it started to change a whole paradigm of how reality was perceived and spirituality perceived within the church. The idea of an icon is that because Jesus Christ became a man, he put on flesh, he had a face, he had a body, he had all of these things. We can now represent a portrait of him and a portrait of God incarnate on earth. So when we have an icon in the church, in a place of worship, it's not counter to what the Jewish culture was saying, what the Jewish culture was saying about idolatry. In fact, it's almost completely within that tradition. If you look at the Ark of the Covenant and objects they made that were supposed to be an embodiment of where God was or where God sat in location and in place, there was a reality surrounding these objects. Now we have, the only difference is with these objects, we now have a face and a human person to put behind that. So iconography to me is very important in my spirituality because it tells me that there is not a wall of separation between the spirit world and the real world. They are on the same plane, and they are there's an incarnational aspect behind it in the way I worship and in art even. It bleeds into art because all art that you create with a kind of iconographic movement behind it becomes an awareness of God and what he does in the real world.
And Zach, thank you so much for sharing from an Orthodox perspective just what icons mean to you and why they're both spiritually and artistically sort of grounded. I would love to get to our other panelists. We'll start with Brian and then move to Stan, and then we'll throw an interesting question back to our guest Brett, which is, what are we doing wrong and how do we fix it? So, Brett, I'm giving you plenty of time to think about that because it's a difficult question. But before we get to that, let's hear from Brian and then from Stan.
Well, darn, you guys took the question right out of my mouth. I mean, that's what I was going to ask. So, shoot. Here's my question to Brett. How difficult is it for you to, on assignment, go out and watch movies that really have no sort of inherent spiritual value, and then try to pluck out what that might mean to the average Christian viewer. Because I know that we don't go see Transformers movies to try to figure out, like, well, how does this fit into my personal theology? What does that mean to you when you're asked to review a movie and you know that there's essentially nothing there that you're going to be able to grab onto?
Right.
How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean that it's definitely I try to avoid being assigned those sorts of films for that exact reason. I don't want to like force a Christian angle on, Transformers or something.
You try to avoid being assigned those.
Well, yeah, I mean the assignment system for Christianity today is you can kind of offer yourself for certain movies and strongly hint that you're the right person for this certain movie. So, but yeah, I mean, sometimes I do get assigned those, and I think the last like popcorn blockbuster that I reviewed was Captain America 2. I'm not sure when that came out, but yeah, but even with those, I tried to I still can't help but apply my Christian lens to those, and I really don't try to come across as forcing anything. And I hate Christian film reviews that are like all about like Christ figures and the symbolism of this and that. So I try to not do that. But I think with my Captain America review, I talked a little bit about embodiment and incarnation again, just with the superhero movies and how indestructible these people are, and how they're being exploded and shot at 100 times constantly, and nothing happens. And how does that kind of perpetuate our already kind of Gnostic tendencies in our society, where we are becoming less oriented towards embodiment and the limits and the just fleshiness of ourselves. So I think that's the angle I took with that film. But I mean, I think if I can introduce a thinker and a writer that I'm a huge fan of that has influenced my approach to criticism, is this French thinker, Michel de Certeau. He writes a lot about agency of viewers and just this idea that as consumers of culture, as readers of culture, we have a lot of power to read into things and to interpret a piece of culture through our lens and through our perspectives, regardless of kind of what the supposed power structures of the creators had in mind. And I think that as Christians, as we view movies, we need to have that sense of agency and that ability to not just take something at face value and just consume it as Hollywood intended it to be consumed necessarily, but to question it and to critique it from a place of integrating it with our faith. And I think that, to kind of begin the answer to that, what do we do now? How do we fix this problem question? I think that's one thing we can do, is just start approaching even the mindless popcorn movies like Transformers through a little bit of like a critical Christian lens, and believing that there's nothing under the sun, there's not one square inch in the whole realm of existence, to quote Kuyper, that is outside of that kind of sovereignty of God idea. And so yeah, that would be one thing that I would say.
And Stan, what do you think about that?
Yes, kind of rewinding just a bit, when we were talking about those movies that clearly try to go after the Christian market, and I think this kind of makes a decent segue. When I saw the Heaven is for Real trailer, I kind of noticed that it didn't talk about Jesus at all. So when I notice those kinds of things, it makes me think like, okay, well, what's the point of this movie? What's the purpose of it? And then when I think about movies like God's Not Dead, the movie is called God's Not Dead so that it sells well at the department store. It's not called, The Tale of the Antagonistic Professor. And I think when I see all these things, what it makes me passionate about making sure that other Christians are as suspicious of this stuff as I am. And, we can talk about how we need to have a greater appreciation of iconography and anchoring ourselves to the material world and the synthesis of created things and spiritual things. And at the same time, we also need to have a really healthy suspicion about contrivance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's kind of like a golden tightrope where, and okay, this is kind of a weird one, but heavy metal music, I really like heavy metal music, and in the 70s and early 80s, it was really authentic and interesting and novel. And then in the late 80s, it got super, super contrived, right? And then it died to grunge, which was like this total iconoclastic rock and roll movement, right? And then it got into like new metal, which was like contrivance again, and then it all fell out into the indie scene. So to me, there's like this almost oscillation, this like mimetic oscillation between this contrived iconography and iconoclasm, where this momentum just kind of pushes big groups of people, into building a bunch of idols and then tearing them all down. And as a guy who, grew up evangelical, converted to Catholicism for like 6 years, and then converted back out, it's kind of interesting how we're all just on different vectors of how we respect one or find danger in the other. And I think there's legitimate perspectives on all sides, but there's like anything that's golden tightrope, it's super manifold, super complicated, and a bunch of different perspectives can be valid simultaneously.
I think also that,
or I was going to say, are we all just like thinking about like just cogitating on, chewing on what Stan just said, or are we lost for words?
Well, I was actually thinking about crappy new metal bands, but
It's a lot of them.
Well, and that also takes off with the renaissance of Christian metal. I mean, like that there was like such a huge underground movement like within the past 10 to 15 years of Christian metal, and it's like become like, and then now it's Christian hip hop. There's like this renaissance of different movements where it starts to take off, and groups tend to congregate around it, and then they kind of maybe get tired of it after a while, or who knows how long any of these movements have steam. But I think about it, and I'm like, there are certain things that are timeless art, and then there are certain things that are just for their time, for their culture, and we have and the respecting of that. So, sorry, I'm interrupting Brett's time, but I just was thinking of metal and the whole like that line of thinking. So, Brandon.
Well, no, I don't think that what you brought up was off topic necessarily. So we have Christians producing Christian art, quote unquote, but a lot of times they're not producing it as Christian art. And a lot of bands and a lot of filmmakers and a lot of artists say, well, we're Christians, but we're not making this from a Christian perspective. And there's that sort of alienation of the idea that as a Christian, you are making art, but you're not making it for the purpose of being a Christian. But that tends to be problematic in and of itself, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a little bit of skepticism that a lot of Christians have towards those I'm a Christian but not a Christian artist type people, which is unfortunate. Even at a place like Biola University, for example, there's alumni of the university. It's an evangelical university who have gone on to be pretty successful as music artists. Cold War Kids would be one example. I don't know if you're familiar with that band, but they're Christians.
Yeah, sure.
They're Christian.
I love them.
Yeah, I mean they're kind of big, a lot bigger a few years ago, but they're Christians who don't make Christian music, but they're still making quality music.
I didn't know that. I went to a show with them.
Yeah,
and Delta Spirit, and it was interesting.
Right, and Delta Spirit's great as well, but I don't think that Biola University would ever kind of bring Cold War Kids to play a show on campus because they're not singing, specifically Christian type music. Right. I mean, I could be wrong. Like they might invite them to play a show, and then there's a question of whether Cold War Kids would actually want to associate themselves with evangelical institution, even if they're alumni of it. But yeah, I think there's this really sad dissonance and tension between Christians who are just doing their thing in the art world, in the music world, and they almost are too scared to do anything too Christian because they don't want to be associated with all the negative stereotypes and the baggage that comes along with the Christian music industry or the Christian film industry. So I think it's sad if all of those negative stereotypes are inhibiting, some Christian from making a film or creating music that does wrestle with Christianity in an overt way. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there's almost this, because if you want to be a legitimate artist, you kind of have to cut yourself off from your faith and not be public about it. I think that's really regrettable and unfortunate. So, I mean, what I would love to see is the church and Christians just really start to get behind these artists and support them in their art making, whatever it may be, and to encourage them to make art that interacts with their faith, but isn't necessarily overt in the same way that CCM is, or something like that.
And I know that Brian wants to jump in and want you a question here, but is there a solution to that you see, or are we stuck in this zeitgeist based or this culturally evangelical based sort of approach to that question?
I mean, I think education is a big part of it, and part of the reason why evangelicals don't have a taste for, super quality art is they just aren't educated and they haven't encountered it. And we don't teach art history in our Christian schools necessarily, and churches don't talk a lot about art, and they don't emphasize quality films or just quality, beautiful art at all. So we just haven't trained ourselves, and we haven't developed a taste for it. And so why would we expect that there would be a hunger or an appreciation for that type of thing? So I mean, my writing, everything that I do is towards that end, I think, of kind of increasing the evangelical sensibilities towards art and culture, appreciating it as such, and learning to love the beautiful, the good, the true, and the beautiful wherever it is, and even understanding the history of it. Like, I would love it if every Christian who wants to be a filmmaker was required to take lots of classes in film history and getting familiar with the greats and understanding the French New Wave and Italian neorealism and
it's a dream
Tarkovsky.
World you're living in, Brett.
It's the Brett McCracken Film School that I'll start one day. I would love it because we're never gonna be creating those types of artists if we're skipping that step. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these church made films and Christian films that are being made. There's this I want to be a Christian, I want to make an impact, I want to make a film, and I'm just going to do it. And they skip that whole part about training and learning from the masters. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci didn't become Leonardo da Vinci overnight just because he had that dream and wanted to do that. He spent years and years developing the craft and studying the masters and learning from just studying, and we can't skip that. So education is so important, and I will shut up now and let someone else talk.
So, no, that was brilliant, by the way. And but at what point do we sort of try to engage the modern Christian American culture and say, you're missing out on a lot of art because of these dogmatic views that you hold?
Yeah.
And it's a difficult question because a lot of those views and those opinions are sort of tightly entwined with the things that people think that they need to do or to feel or to be in order to be Christians. So how do we break them apart from that evangelical or American Christian cultural zeitgeist and show them that there is beauty and wonder and art in ways and in areas that they might not have expected to find it?
Does anyone else want to speak?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure. I think for me, it's kind of a mimetic battle. So it's like if
you have said mimetic, I think twice so far. So I'm keeping a counter on.
And I wanted to do it more.
It's a good word.
I'll try to work it in a few more times. But to me, it's like it's the folks who are passionate about it have to get audibly passionate about it. Campaign for it, right? So like you saw this Ferguson thing blow up on Twitter, and a lot of Christians on Twitter getting and big name Christians getting really involved in like retweeting all this stuff about Ferguson and getting this really well serviced and all this kind of stuff, and that's great because they're really passionate about that. That kind of zeal and conviction has to also be applied. And it's exactly what you are doing. Like you're almost fighting a mimetic war by being a person who is super passionate about writing about this stuff and catalyzing a greater appreciation for it. And it requires that everyone who is enthusiastic about it needs to be audibly and visibly enthusiastic about it so that everyone sees how awesome it is. Everyone sees how convicted other folks are. There's also this thing in product management called, at least in social games, called social proof, where when you see other people doing something, it's kind of like this herd signal for you. It like tells you, hey, hold on, look over here. There's something really awesome you should be paying attention to. And those are all kind of weapons in our mimetic warfare. Yes, I got another one.
I think that's, mimetic is right on. So keep using that word because it's
he uses it a lot. You don't even have to tell him twice.
I heard recently, something about like 95% of how we learn and how we grow is by imitation and by just seeing others and observing others. And it's so important. And you're right. I mean, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to be a public zealot, and champion for great art. And just to use one specific example of, Terrence Malick, like anyone who has followed me for any time knows that I'm a huge, obsessive supporter and fan of Malick. And every chance I get, I'm, holding a screening of one of his films. Like I've done that at Biola. I've done that at my church. I, held a film festival at my church where I screened Malick films and created panel discussions about them. Like doing that sort of thing is, publicly showing, your love for that and how deeply it affects you as a Christian on that faith level. I think we can't underestimate the importance of that. And that's why I think within our churches, if we can like mobilize the people within our churches who are passionate about the arts and who have, a favorite artist or a favorite filmmaker or musician, and just give them the opportunity to let's host a screening of those films that you love and share with us why you love them. I did the same thing at my church with the Dardenne brothers films. I showed a few of them and opened the eyes of many people who had never seen a Dardenne brothers film, and had no idea that a couple of Belgian, secular film directors could make movies that were so clearly haunted by, the vestiges of Christianity and faith. And I think the mimetic thing is hugely important, and we all need to, go public with our love for the arts. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you mentioned that that you're one of your favorite filmmakers, I was thinking of one of mine was Aronofsky, Darren Aronofsky, and one of my favorite films is The Fountain, and that movie just blows my mind every time I see it. I have a spiritual experience when I see it because of the way that it just speaks. I mean, it's not a straightforward narrative. There's no like completion even at the ending. There's no if you contrast it with Christian films that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a closed narrative. The Fountain doesn't have that, and in some ways,
no,
it
and it
feels...
was critically panned for some of the reasons that you described.
I mean, yeah, but like, to me, as somebody who just loves beauty, I see beauty, and even in the saddest, most disparaging parts of that film, I see a beauty, because, I mean, even the cinematic quality of it, the images that came on screen, there was a beauty there. And I think Aronofsky is one of those filmmakers who has a spiritual center. He has something there that's a spiritual center. We even see it in the Noah movie, which we can talk about a little bit. I don't know if anybody else wants to, about how that was received, but you know, when I saw the movie, you know, everybody was giving it crap, and I'm thinking, I'm just going to watch it for what it is. And by the end, I was like, I really like this movie.
Yeah.
Compared to what everybody else was saying. I mean, it's not his best work, but or even Requiem for a Dream, which is just really depressing. You have a spiritual center there. So I guess my point is, like, there are artists out there who don't, who aren't Christians, and maybe don't even claim to be Christians, but I think that as Christians, we can find a community, a spiritual center that is somewhere in there that God is speaking through that, you know?
And I think that the one of the takeaway points there is that Christianity is not always clean, and it's not always something that we should want to claim. I mean, you look throughout the scriptures, throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's a lot of stuff there that we wrestle with, but the fact that we wrestle with it is beautiful in and of itself, because we wrestle with art, and if we're not struggling with it and trying to reconcile it with our own predispositions and our own faith, then we're not actually participating with the art. We're a mere viewer rather than a participate. I was going to say a participator, but a participant. And participating in the arts is so important. So thank you, Zach, for raising that point.
Yeah, I think something that Zach said reminded me of the concept of common grace, which I think it's so important that we kind of rediscover that idea in the church. And if we don't have a robust understanding of common grace, then we're never going to be able to get any progress in this area. Because if we understand common grace, this idea that, like, by God's grace, their secular people, non-believers, even atheists, can create something beautiful and true and good. If we don't believe that, then we're never going to be able to convince our fellow Christians to pay any attention to Darren Aronofsky or any other artist. But if we can articulate that theology of common grace, and just the idea that there is value in what the art that non-Christians make, because art by its very nature is seeking truth. It's seeking after better understanding existence, and it's wrestling with that, and it's about illumination. It's about focusing our attention on things in a way we might not have noticed before, and there's value in that for all of us, for any human, whatever your beliefs or religion. So we just need to kind of better articulate that broad idea if we want to make any progress in this area, I think.
I couldn't agree more, Brett. And I mean, well, what you've said we could discuss this and expound upon it for hours and hours and hours, but those are hours and hours and hours this evening that you actually don't have. So we will extend an invitation to you very, very soon to come back on our podcast and talk more about this very important subject, because it's something that all of us wonder about, and we're concerned about it too, because we're all by nature creatives. And as creative people, we're doing two things. We're mimicking the creator himself of all life, but we're also glorifying him through the things that we create when we create honestly, from a sort of central point of our being. Mm-hmm. That's what creativity is all about. It spills out of the this desire to express things that we haven't been able to express in simple words, or I don't know, trying to recreate the creative process, or trying to explain it is sort of ineffable in and of itself. So for the purposes of this brief podcast, because you've got to go in just a few minutes, I do want to get to something a little bit less weighty and a little bit less headspace driven. And I want to talk about what each of us have been consuming, listening to, what our recommendations are for this week. So we will start actually with you, Brett. Is there anything that you've been reading? Is there anything that you've been listening to? Is there anything that you've been sort of consuming recently that's really affected you?
I mean, I'm always there's always a lot that I could share to that question, but I mean, film-wise, I think Boyhood was the biggest film this summer that affected me in a profound way. I'm a big Linklater fan in general, but I thought that film was just like a magnum opus. So that's one. I've actually been really enjoying the show The Leftovers on HBO. I don't know if anyone else has seen that or has been keeping up with that, but I think, just coming from a kind of a Rapture orientation in my youth and being so familiar with that genre and seeing this kind of secular take on it is very interesting, and just a lot of great faith stuff in there. And then a preemptive plug, which maybe doesn't even count because I haven't actually read it, but I know it's going to be amazing, is the new book from Marilyn Robinson that comes out in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's called Lila. It's part 3 in her Gilead trilogy. So if anyone has not read Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, which novel that won the Pulitzer Prize probably 10 years ago, go out and read that immediately, because it's probably the best example of being a Christian and doing art well in the last decade that I've seen. The part 3 in that literary trilogy comes out in a few weeks, and it's probably the most excited I've been for anything all year, except for Terrence Malick's other films, which are coming out supposedly in the next year.
I read the first in the Gilead trilogy, and unfortunately I haven't read beyond that, but I am excited to pick up on that and continue reading. So thank you for your recommendations. And where are you going for dinner tonight?
My wife and I live in Orange, California, which is just a kind of quaint little town here in Orange County, and we can walk to this old kind of town square circle. So we're just going to walk out there and see what we find. And
that counts as a recommendation too. So thank you.
Come to Orange. I'll take you to my favorite spots. I would love that.
So let's move on to Zach. What are your recommendations for this evening?
Well, you've caught me scrambling to find one, but because I think I recommend every week the same thing. I've been watching The Wire, but you don't want to hear me talk more about that.
No, we don't. None of us have seen it. Sorry.
I don't know why, but it's...
I know who Omar is. I read Entertainment Weekly, but that's about the extent of my experience.
Okay, shame on you for knowing who Omar is, but not watching The Wire. Anyway, I'm going to say an old school movie recommendation, one that isn't a movie that came out recently at all. But I did watch it recently for the first time, is The Station Agent. which is
You only just recently watched that?
yes,
Seriously?
because it's on Amazon Prime, and I just got Amazon Prime, so
Nice.
it's one of Peter Dinklage's first films. Actually, it probably is his first feature film, I'm guessing, but it's really good. It's about a guy who wants to be like, a hermit, and he inherits this this train depot out in the middle of, out in the edge of this small town, and there's a community of people that start to push into his life, even though he reluctantly becomes a part of their life. So I liked it, and it showed the breadth of Tyrion Lannister in his heyday, and I also like what's her name, Patricia Clarkson, I think. She's one of my favorite actresses, and she's so underrated. I just love pretty much everything she does. So anyway, that's my recommendation, and you can chastise me later, Brandon.
And you know that I will in the phone call following this conversation. So knowing that you've got a very frustrating reckoning coming to you, let's move on to Stan. And Stan, what have you consumed lately? Although you can talk about the food that you've eaten, but literature, film, art, what have you been moved by lately?
My wife and I actually recently finished season 1 of The Wire, which we loved through Amazon Prime, and so we're going to probably be continuing on that. We're also kind of chewing through Parks and Recreation like candy through Amazon Prime. Basically, we're doing this because I'm home for 6 weeks dealing with the new, beautiful newborn baby daughter, and so we're trying to figure out entertainment to keep our sanity. But the thing I really wanted to recommend, just kind of on the lines of what our topic tonight was the 2012 Robert Zemeckis directed movie starring Denzel Washington entitled Flight. It is a Christian movie in the sense that we've been talking about, insofar as it's heavy with themes and difficult, challenging things for the viewer to grapple with. And it, in particular, it really challenges the notion of what it means in a movie to, for the protagonist to win, and what it means for him to escape, and what it means for him to be saved. And so I would highly recommend Flight.
Yes.
Yeah, I would second that. Great film.
And we'll move on here to my twin brother, partner in crime, and mostly useless individual, Brian.
Yes, that's correct.
Ouch.
It's fine.
What can you recommend that won't destroy us this weekend?
3 things. First of all, we talked about the movie Her tonight. Please watch it. Enjoy it. After you watch it, read Brett McCracken's review. It will allow you to experience the movie in another dimension. And I wouldn't recommend reading his review before seeing the movie, because that's how good the review is. It's so good that you need to watch the movie first and then read the review.
You're not getting his books for free. You know that. You still have to pay for those.
No. I've been listening to The National a lot. Their latest album, which came out last year, Trouble Will Find Me, is probably my favorite record of theirs, but their entire catalog is good. And the thing that most affected me this week, on the week of the anniversary of September 11, 2001, Tom Junod, don't know how to pronounce his last name, and I searched for a pronunciation, and there was none, wrote a great piece for Esquire several years ago called The Falling Man.
Oh, yeah.
If you go to, if you search it on Google, The Falling Man, you will get a landing page that asks you to donate to the James Foley Scholarship Fund. That is the journalist who was beheaded by ISIL, the Islamic State. You can bypass that page and read the piece for free, but I would urge you to donate to that scholarship fund. It is worth the $2.99 suggested donation, and it's an incredible piece, and it benefits an incredible cause.
Thank you, Brian, for talking about some lighthearted things and then bringing us back to, sort of the reality
Man, I'm
of
depressed.
But the reality of the situation that we live in the world that we live in is that there are these dark chapters in American history that we're still reckoning with. So thank you for illuminating some, showing some light and hope in those. And as far as my recommendations go, this is not just because he's a guest on our show, but I've been a fan of Brett for a long time, and his books, Hipster Christianity and Gray Matters, both of which I hope that we get to explore on this show a little bit more, are real sort of windows into evangelical opportunity in our culture. They're not merely explanatory. They're both very, and Brett, I think you admit this yourself, but you're a fan of lists, and you're a fan of pop culture information and just tidbits of interest, and his books are extremely interesting, but they're also extremely relevant to our Christian culture in an era where relevance seems to take precedence over and gosh, guys, help me, but the Christian faith as a whole. The tradition, the aesthetic, the everything that Brett's about is what we're about at Theologues, which is bringing the relevant bits of Christianity to the forefront because they're eternally relevant, not just relevant to our culture. So I will recommend Brett's books. And another thing that I would like to recommend is, and forgive me, I recommend dad stuff all the time because I'm a new father, but my kid is teething, and clove oil.
You'll get tired of it, believe me.
All right. You can, you can just shuddy a little bit while I'm talking about this. But clove oil in a suspension of olive oil can soothe those teething pains without medication. So that's a tip for you, Stan. But one other thing that I would also like to recommend is get out there, learn more about the world, and this isn't a recommendation so much as it is an admonition. There's a ton going on in the world that's not forefront in the news. We all hear about ISIS. We all hear about the Islamic State is huge in the news right now, but Scottish independence is a huge deal. We also have things like the ongoing conflict in Russia and Ukraine. It's a huge deal. So please take the time out of your day to educate yourself and learn more about what's going on in our world, because whether or not we feel the effects here in America as privileged people, we also have a responsibility to give and love and to be there for those people, those Christians and even non-Christians in those nations that are suffering. So that is my recommendation for the evening. But I want to give the last word to our guest, Brett McCracken. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. And what are the takeaway points from, excuse me, as my voice becomes crackly, but what are the takeaway points from this podcast that you want people to go home with?
Yeah, I mean, if I can add one more recommendation and then kind of tease out a point from that. So the show True Detective I just finished. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but very dark. If we're talking about the darkness of the world, that's a show that really kind of, you see how dark the world is, and yet the final episode of the series, it's called Form and Void, and it really moved me in the sense of this idea of, form and void. It's an allusion to the creation of the world and God bringing order out of the void, bringing form to the void. And I think that that's a beautiful picture of the type of creation that we can do as humans. Just as God brought order out of chaos and it is bringing order out of chaos, so too we have that capacity, and that's what art is. I think all art making, all culture making is an attempt to order the chaos of our world. And it is a chaotic world. It's a dark, chaotic world. And the ISIS beheadings, everything that you just mentioned, Brandon gets at that fact. But that's why culture and art is so important, because these are attempts to bring order out of it, to make sense of it. And that's what makes it beautiful. The ordering of the garden and the task that God gave Adam is our task as well. It's to make this world a more ordered and sensible place. So I think that's the charge that I would want to leave with everyone, is just to find your place in that task of bringing form out of the void.
Thank you so much, Brett, for joining us this evening on our podcast. And I know that you've got to go, but it's been a pleasure, and
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all. Yeah, it was very fun.
Thanks,
great
Brett.
Conversation.
We hope to have you back sometime very soon.
Definitely.
And for you and for all the rest of us, thank you for joining us this evening on the Theologues podcast. And Brett, just before we leave, let people know where they can find you online. And then I promise I will cut you off and you can go and enjoy the rest of your night.
You can find me on Twitter at Brett McCracken, or my blog, which I don't update nearly as often as I used to, or I should, but it's called The Search, stillsearching.wordpress.com. So thank you guys again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, Brett.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And we will talk to you all soon. Thank you so much for participating in this podcast with us. This has been a real pleasure and a real good journey. So for myself and Brian, Zach, and Stan, and hopefully for Brett, we would just love to thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you guys next time.